Growing up, at times I remember my mum often calling the names of different members of my family many, many times, asking me or my brothers or sisters to do certain things. And when you hear your name repeated over and over again, most people will start to pay some sort of attention. I know for myself as a child and as a teenager, and I've also got the sense, hearing from other young people, that one of the common failings of sometimes of young people is not being able to listen to their parents, because there's so many other distractions. And so sometimes, and I know from parents, it becomes a little bit of a frustration when some of their children don't listen to them, and they've got to call out their name over and over again. Here in our first reading today, we have the name Samuel, and it gets repeated 14 times in one passage. Imagine saying a person's name 14 times in about 90 seconds. And that's what we got with this first reading today. God's trying to call Samuel, and he wants Samuel to listen. Samuel was only a young child, probably about 7, 8 years old. We're told he doesn't yet know the law, and he hadn't yet understood the word of God, which means he probably hadn't got to the age of being able to read the Jewish scriptures. The Jewish scriptures, normally young children would be required by the age of about 12 to be able to get up and read the Jewish scriptures and to know the law. So they're saying that he's younger than that, probably about 7 or 8. Samuel was living in the temple, a little bit like a boarding house, you could say. And he was learning how to become a Jewish priest or a prophet. And he was there helping one of the high priests, Eli. Middle of the night, Samuel hears this voice calling his name, Samuel, Samuel, as we heard. As we know, Samuel gets up, goes to Eli, having been woken up in the middle of the night, and says, "What do you want?" And he said, "I'm not calling you, go back to sleep. Go and lie down again." We have this happen 3 times, and then Eli works out what's happening. That God is calling Samuel. And so Samuel's asked to respond, "Speak, Lord, your servant is listening." Each of us are called to be servants. In our own family contexts, whether we're young children, whether we're teenagers, or whether we become adults, when someone calls us by name, they want us often to respond. Not with what we want for ourselves, but to respond as servants. I know that's my experience in my own family growing up, and I'm sure that's been others' experience as well. That we're called to be servants of our family, servants of God, servants of what is good. And so we're called to listen. Over the last 2 weeks, last week we had the Feast of the Baptism of the Lord, where we hear a voice from the heavens saying, "This is my Son, the beloved, with whom I am well pleased." And we're called to listen for that voice. And the week before that, we had the solemnity of Epiphany, where the wise men come to Bethlehem to see, to look, and to believe. Our gospel today is about seeing. I was told as a child by my parents not to stare at people, because staring sometimes is rude. However, in our gospel tonight, we have John the Baptist, who's there staring hard at Jesus, we're told. He's looking and sees Jesus going by, and he's staring, and he tells others, "Look over there." And they all start to stare and look at Jesus. And then a number of John the Baptist's followers saying, "We're going to go follow this guy." And so they start to wander up behind Jesus. They haven't gone and said hello or anything. They're just walking behind Jesus. They've been looking at him, and probably Jesus noticed that they were looking at him, and they come up behind Jesus. And then Jesus turns around and says, "What are you doing? What do you want?" Sees these people following him. And they sort of come up with a response, "Well, where do you live?" And Jesus says, "Come and see." And so Jesus wants them to look. To not just look at him, but to look at his life and look at what Jesus is offering. And looking is important. The first reading is about hearing. So we're called to listen to God in our life, to find space in the midst of a noisy world, to find some silence, like Samuel did, to be able to listen and work out what is God asking us to do. And then we're called to see. And we're called to see with the eyes of faith. So John the Baptist stares, he sees. Jesus says to those following after him, come and see, come and look. And then at the end of the gospel tonight, we have Jesus looking at Simon and gives him a new name, a mission. He says, you're going to be called Cephas. You're going to be the rock, Simon Peter. Looking and listening. This is what we do when we come to Mass. We listen to the Scriptures and we look, we see. We see not just with human eyes, but we see with eyes of faith. So Paul, writing to the Corinthians in the second reading, gives us an explanation of a trap that we can fall into. And sometimes it's a very common trap that we can fall into, that we just listen to what I want, what we want, each of us individually, or see with the eyes of what we want with our own passions or interests. And so Paul's talking mainly about sexual sin, but I think it's broader than just sexual sins. That when we focus and listen only to what our own heart wants or what our own gut wants, and we don't think of what actually is God's will, what's for the glory of God, then we're going to get into trouble in all sorts of ways. And we've seen this over the last few weeks, especially in the United States, but in other parts of the world as well, where people have thought with their gut, where they've thought with what they want for themselves, and not necessarily thought for what is God's will, what is for God's glory. And that's a challenge. St. Benedict, many hundreds of years ago, who started the Benedictine religious order, he talked about heresy. And he said a heresy is when you take a truth, a very small, a minute amount of truth, and you blow it up so that all you see is that one little bit of truth. And that's what can happen in our lives as well. That when we focus so much on one little thing for ourselves, or we think of justice for this thing, or we think of someone's rights in this context, or individual freedom in that context, and we blow that up and make that the most important focus, it's going to create conflict and not God's will. So we're called, like Samuel, we're called to listen. Listen carefully. That requires some silence. And then we're called to look intensely, not just at what I want or what you want, or what we're told by the media to what the things that we want, but we look to Jesus. And we see his life, and we walk in his life. We see his house, and we say, this is what we want. So let us look with the eyes of faith. Let us listen intently. Let's not be in autopilot. But when we enter into our Eucharistic prayer in a minute, let's listen carefully, intently to the words, as if we're hearing them for the first time. And then let's look intently with faith at the altar, at the host, at the chalice, and see Jesus Christ. And then want to go and walk in that way with Jesus. The response of Samuel is, "Speak, Lord, your servant is listening." And as we heard in the psalm, "Here I am, Lord, I come to do your will." Let's be this our focus for this week. Let us listen, let us look, and let us become the servants of Jesus Christ again in our world this week.